The galactic concord had existed for 900 years. 9 centuries of careful diplomacy, of species learning to share star lanes and trading routes, of wars avoided through long meetings and longer silences. The concord was not perfect. No body of 17 alien civilizations ever could be, but it worked. It held. And for most of those 900 years, humanity had not been part of it. Humans arrived late to the galaxy. They had spent their early centuries tearing each other apart on a single blue world, then their middle centuries crawling to their own moon, their own red neighbor, their own outer planets. By the time human ships finally punched through the boundary of their home system at genuine speed, the rest of the galaxy had already drawn its maps, written its laws, and decided where the important tables were. Humanity was given a seat at one of those tables. The smallest one, near the back, beside the refreshment station. Nobody said this out loud. They didn't need to. The positioning was enough. The Velhari were the ones who set that tone early. They were tall, blue-skinned, with 4 arms and a history of conquest. They had since refined into something they called civilized expansion. They had absorbed 11 smaller civilizations across 3 centuries and considered themselves the architectural backbone of the Concord. When humans first entered the chamber of the Grand Assembly, it was a Velhari diplomat named Sorith Vel who looked them over slowly, then turned back to his colleagues and resumed a conversation as though the newcomers had not arrived. Ambassador Lena Vasquez had noticed. She had said nothing. She took her seat near the back and studied the room. That was 12 years ago. In those 12 years, humanity had participated in 31 Concord sessions. They had voted on trade agreements, border resolutions, and resource-sharing protocols. They had offered opinions that were sometimes heard and more often politely set aside. They had contributed scientific data from their probes, their stations, their deep space surveys, data that other species quietly incorporated into their own research without formal acknowledgement. And then came the Dravith Corridor dispute. The corridor was a dense region of navigable space connecting the outer rim to the central trading hubs. It passed through territories claimed by 4 different species: the Velhari, the Joruan, the Mechari Collective, and a smaller species called the Thalvine, who had lived in the corridor's edge systems for 300 years and built their entire civilization around the trade it carried. The dispute was over a newly discovered hyperspace node inside the corridor that could cut travel time by 40%. Every major power wanted control of it. The Thalvine, whose home system sat closest to the node, simply wanted to survive the argument. Humanity had a proposal. Ambassador Vasquez had spent 4 months preparing it with a team of 18 specialists, engineers, economists, historians, 3 Xena diplomats, and a quiet man named Dr. Arash Karimi, who had spent his career studying the collapse of resource-sharing agreements. The proposal was elegant. It established a joint administrative body for the node, created tiered access rights based on historical usage, included protections for Thalvine sovereignty, and built in an automatic review process every 20 years. It solved everything. Every human on the team believed that. They presented it at the 402nd Grand Assembly session. Sorith Vel let them finish. Then he leaned toward his colleague and said something in the Velhari primary tongue. His colleague made a sound that might have been a laugh. Then Sorith Vel looked at the human delegation and said, in the Concord's common trade language, that the proposal was thoughtful for a young species. The Joruan representative said they appreciated humanity's enthusiasm, but felt the proposal lacked the weight of experience. The Mechari Collective spokesperson said nothing. They rarely did. They simply marked their opposition on the voting record. The proposal failed. Not narrowly. Comprehensively. 12 votes against, 3 abstentions, and 2 in favor. Humanity and the Thalvine, who had tears in what passed for their eyes when the count was read. Ambassador Vasquez sat very still when the result was announced. Dr. Karimi, beside her, watched her face. She was not angry. She was thinking. He had worked with her long enough to know the difference. And the difference mattered enormously. Back at the human diplomatic station, a modest structure orbiting a neutral asteroid near the Concord's central systems, Vasquez called a meeting that night. Not a formal briefing. She ordered food from the station's kitchen, pushed the conference table to one side, and gathered her team in a loose circle of chairs and floor cushions. Then she said, simply, "Tell me what you saw." They talked for 6 hours. What they had seen, assembled piece by piece over those hours, was a structure. Not a conspiracy, nothing so dramatic. Just a structure. The Velhari controlled the agenda-setting committee. The Joruan controlled 3 of the 7 seats on the resource arbitration panel. The Mechari Collective provided 60% of the Concord's administrative staff, which meant they controlled what information reached the chamber floor and in what form. The smaller species, the Thalvine, the Prethali, the Corvine, had votes but almost never used them against the 3 dominant powers because the dominant powers controlled access to trade, fuel, medical technology, and ship maintenance infrastructure. Humanity had none of that. Humanity had good proposals and a seat near the refreshments. "They're not evil," said Dr. Karimi at around the 3rd hour. "That's the important thing to understand. They've just been doing this for centuries. The structure serves them, so they maintain the structure. They don't even think about it most of the time. It's like gravity. It's just how things work. And we walked in expecting to change gravity with a PowerPoint," said Lieutenant Commander Yoel Ben David, the team's security liaison, who had a dry delivery that usually landed harder than she intended. Nobody laughed, but several people smiled. Vasquez hadn't said much during those 6 hours. She'd asked questions, pushed for precision, made people back up and clarify when they were being vague. Near the end, one of the younger diplomats, a 29-year-old named Femi Osei who had joined the mission fresh from Earth's Foreign Service Academy, asked her directly, "So what do we do? Do we escalate? Do we make noise? Do we threaten to leave the Concorde?" Vasquez looked at him for a long moment. Outside the station's viewports, the stars were very steady and very cold. "None of those," she said. "Then what?" "We stepped back," she said. The room went quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet, thoughtful quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when something unexpected has been said and everyone is turning it over to see what it means. "We've been playing their game," Vasquez continued. "We've been walking into their chamber, presenting proposals in their format, using their procedure, accepting their framing of what good diplomacy looks like. And every time we do that, we're telling them, and telling ourselves, that their rules are the only rules." She stood up and walked to the viewport. "So we stop. We don't make demands. We don't issue ultimatums. We don't threaten. We just stop participating in the parts of this that aren't working for us or anyone else. Quietly, professionally. And we start doing something else instead." "What else?" asked Dr. Karimi. She turned back to the room. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. The look of someone who has figured out the shape of a very large thing. "We start talking to the people who also have seats near the refreshment station," she said. Nobody fully understood what she meant that night. They would in time. In quite a short time, actually, because Vasquez moved fast when she had decided on a direction. But that night, the team dispersed to their quarters, and the station hummed softly around them, and the Galactic Concorde continued its ancient business in its ancient ways, entirely unaware that something had just shifted. Not with a declaration, not with a threat, with a decision made in a room full of tired, thoughtful people eating cold food near a pushed-aside conference table. The Velhari, had they known, might have laughed again. They would not laugh later. The first thing Ambassador Vasquez did was cancel 3 meetings. Not dramatically, not with a public statement or a formal letter of protest. She simply sent polite messages to the relevant Concorde offices explaining that the human delegation would be unable to attend the upcoming sessions of the Resource Arbitration Subpanel, the Navigational Standards Working Group, and the Cultural Exchange Coordination Forum. She cited scheduling conflicts. She thanked them for their understanding. She wished them productive sessions. The Concorde offices sent back equally polite acknowledgments. Nobody flagged it as unusual. Delegations missed subpanel meetings all the time. It was considered mildly unprofessional, but not alarming. What nobody noticed, because nobody was paying close enough attention to humanity yet, was that Vasquez had spent 2 weeks before sending those messages carefully identifying which meetings were worth canceling. The 3 she chose had one thing in common. They were meetings where human input was routinely noted, thanked, and then set aside. They consumed enormous amounts of her team's preparation time and returned almost nothing. Canceling them freed up 42 hours of skilled human attention per week. She redirected every one of those hours. Some of them went toward Dr. Karimi's new project, which he had taken to calling the cartography, though it had nothing to do with maps of space. He was mapping relationships. Every species in the Concord, every bilateral agreement, every dependency, every point of leverage, and every point of vulnerability. He was building a picture of the Concord not as it presented itself, a noble assembly of equal voices, but as it actually functioned, which was considerably more interesting and considerably less noble. What the cartography revealed, slowly and then all at once, was something that should have been obvious from the start, but had been obscured by the grandeur of the Concord's self-presentation. The Velhari, the Jorwin, and the Mechari collective were dominant, yes. But they were dominant in specific ways that had specific cracks in them. The Velhari controlled agenda setting, but they were deeply dependent on Jorwin fuel processing technology for their fleet operations. They would never publicly admit this. The Jorwin, for their part, controlled resource arbitration, but their agricultural systems were fragile. 3 of their 4 primary food-producing worlds had soil compositions that required a biological supplement produced almost exclusively by a small Mechari biotech firm. The Mechari collective controlled information flow and administrative infrastructure, but their species had a profound cultural aversion to direct confrontation. They influenced through process, through procedure, through the slow accumulation of bureaucratic advantage. Put them in a situation where process didn't protect them, and they became uncomfortable in ways they tried very hard not to show. None of this was secret. All of it was in records that anyone could access. But nobody had bothered to put it together in one place and look at it clearly, because for 900 years the balance had held, and nobody had needed to. Humanity had needed to. So humanity had. The other place Vasquez redirected her team's hours was toward a series of quiet conversations. She started with the Thalvine. The Thalvine ambassador was a small being named Vithis Sorn, with a voice like wind through hollow reeds and a habit of touching the walls of rooms when he walked into them, as though reassuring himself they were solid. He had been in the Concord for 30 years and had learned, through 30 years of disappointment, to want very little. When Vasquez asked to meet with him privately, not at the Concord station, but at a small Thalvine trading post in a nearby system, he had agreed with a caution that was almost painful to observe. She brought Dr. Karimi and Femi Osei. She brought no formal proposals, no policy documents, no presentation materials. She brought food from Earth, actual food, shipped at considerable expense, because she had learned from her research that the Thalvine placed enormous cultural significance on shared meals. She brought spiced flatbread and something sweet made with honey and dried fruit, and she set it on the table between them without ceremony. Vithis Sorn had touched the table when he sat down. Then he looked at the food for a long moment. "Why are you here?" he asked. His common tongue was precise and careful, learned well. "Because the vote went 12-2, Vasquez said, "and I want to understand what that feels like from where you're sitting." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It feels like it has always felt. Like we are furniture, present in the room, occasionally useful, never consulted about where we are placed." "We felt that too," Vasquez said. He looked at her with an expression that was hard to read across the species divide, but which Osei later described in his notes as measuring. The Thalvine ambassador was measuring whether she meant it or whether this was a new kind of performance. "You are humans," Vithis Sorn said finally. "You have been here 12 years. We have been furniture for 300. I do not think you understand what we feel, but I think perhaps you are beginning to." It was not a warm endorsement. It was, however, honest. And Vasquez valued honesty over warmth almost every time. They talked for 4 hours. Not about proposals or policies. About the corridor. About the Thalvine families who lived in the edge systems closest to the hyperspace node. About the trade routes that their entire economy depended on, and what would happen to those routes if one of the 3 dominant powers took unilateral control of the node. About what 300 years of being furniture looked like from the inside. When Vasquez left, Vithis Sorn walked with her to the docking area. At the door, he said, "What are you planning?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But I'm not planning to walk back into that chamber and present another proposal in the same format, and hope the result is different." He made a sound she couldn't quite interpret. "Good," he said. "That would be the definition of something I once heard a human call madness." She smiled. Something like that. Over the next 6 weeks, she had similar conversations with 4 other small species ambassadors. The Prethali, whose entire diplomatic history consisted of carefully worded abstentions. The Corvine, who had twice attempted to bring environmental protection legislation to the assembly floor and twice watched it die before a vote could be called. The Sothrani, who were new to the Concord, newer than humanity, and still in the phase of believing that if they were patient and polite and followed all the correct procedures, the system would eventually reward them. And the Kelvari, who had stopped believing that about 200 years ago and had since retreated into a quiet, dignified fury that they expressed through absolute minimum participation. Each conversation was different. Each species had different concerns, different histories, different cultural communication styles. Osei, who proved to have a remarkable instinct for cross-species rapport, adapted the approach for each meeting. Different foods, different settings, different pacing. With the Corvine, they met outdoors on an artificial garden habitat and talked while walking. With the Sothrani, they communicated partially through written exchange because the Sothrani found spoken conversation with new species exhausting. With the Kelvari, Vasquez simply sat across a table from their ancient, tired-looking ambassador and said, "Tell me what you gave up on and when." That meeting lasted 8 hours. The Kelvari ambassador talked for most of them. Vasquez mostly listened. By the end of the 6th week, no agreements had been signed. No alliance had been announced. Nothing had been formally proposed or officially communicated. But 6 small species ambassadors knew each other's names, each other's grievances, and each other's bottom lines in ways they had never known before. And they had all, separately and without being asked, begun to share information with Dr. Karimi's cartography project. Back at the Concord, Sorethvel noted that the human delegation had been quieter than usual lately. He mentioned it to his aide as a mild curiosity. His aide checked the records and confirmed that humans had missed several subpanel sessions but had attended all Grand Assembly plenary meetings without incident. Probably recalibrating, Sorethvel said. Young species often go through a period of withdrawal when they realize the pace of progress is slower than they imagined. His aide agreed. They moved on to more pressing matters. At the human station, Vasquez was reviewing Dr. Karimi's latest cartography update when Osei knocked on her office door. He had a look she had come to recognize, the look of someone who had just understood something they hadn't been able to articulate before. "We're not building an opposition," he said. "No," she agreed. "We're building a constituency." She looked at him for a moment. Outside her viewport, a Velhari courier ship cut smoothly through the dark, running its quiet freight between systems that had been mapped and managed and controlled for centuries. "Welcome to the 2nd week of your actual education," she said. He laughed, and it echoed in the small room, and it sounded like something beginning. The 407th Grand Assembly session was supposed to be routine. The agenda included 3 items: a routine renewal of the Concord's Central Communications Charter, a procedural vote on expanding the Navigational Standards Working Group, and the long-anticipated second reading of the Dravith Corridor Resource Management Act, the dominant power's answer to the dispute that humanity's proposal had failed to resolve 5 sessions earlier. The Corridor Act was written by a Velhari legal team, reviewed by the Jorwin Resource Panel, and administratively formatted by the Mechari Collective. It gave joint administrative control of the hyperspace node to those 3 powers, created a licensing structure for other species to access the node at considerable cost, and included a clause that effectively nullified the Thalvine's historical usage rights within 18 months. Nobody expected any of this to be complicated. The dominant powers had the votes. The small species would abstain or register token opposition. The act would pass and become law. The Dravith Corridor would be reorganized according to the interests of the 3 powers who had always organized it. Ambassador Vasquez arrived early to the 407th session. Her full delegation arrived with her, which was itself slightly unusual. She sometimes sent junior staff to routine sessions. Today, everyone was present. They sat at their assigned places, near the back, near the refreshments, and they were very calm. The Communications Charter renewal passed without incident. The Working Group expansion passed without incident. Then the Corridor Act came to the floor. Sorethvel presented it with practiced ease. He cited the months of preparation, the legal rigor, the economic modeling. He spoke about the importance of managing a critical resource responsibly and highlighted the licensing structure as a generous provision for smaller species who wished to benefit from the node's efficiency gains. He did not mention the Thalvine's nullified usage rights. He mentioned their transition assistance package, which was 3 paragraphs near the end of the act that allocated a modest fund for economic adjustment. When he finished, the chamber president opened the floor for responses before the vote. This was a formality. Responses in grand assembly sessions were usually brief statements for the record, a species noting its support or its reservations, rarely more than a few minutes. Vithis of the Thalvine rose first. This was not unusual. The Thalvine had the most direct stake in the act and had been expected to register formal objection before being outvoted. What was slightly unusual was that Vithis did not look like a diplomat who had accepted the inevitable. He looked, for the first time in the memory of anyone who had watched Concord sessions for the last decade, like someone who had something to say. He spoke for 12 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not make accusations. He presented data, specific, sourced, meticulously organized data, about the economic impact of the Act's licensing structure on Thalvine trade routes, the timeline of the usage rights nullification and its effect on families currently living in the affected systems, and the gap between the transition assistance package's allocated funds and the actual cost of economic adjustment as calculated by 3 independent economic models. He cited the models by name and institution. He made clear that the Thalvine did not oppose development of the hyperspace node. He made clear, with quiet precision, exactly what they did oppose and why. The chamber was not silent when he finished, because Concord chambers are never truly silent. There is always the hum of translation systems, the ambient sound of dozens of species present. But the attentive quality of the silence was different than usual. Then the Pre-Thale representative rose. The Pre-Thale had never, in 30 years of Concord membership, spoken for more than 4 minutes in a floor response. Their representative spoke for 9 minutes and presented a formal legal analysis questioning whether the Act's licensing structure was consistent with the Concord's Foundational Access Rights Charter, the same charter that had just been renewed, without amendment, 2 agenda items earlier. The analysis was not theirs. It had been prepared, with the Pre-Thale's approval and input, by a legal team assembled by the human delegation over the past 3 weeks. The Corvine representative presented environmental impact data on the node development plan that the Act contained. The data showed a 34% probability of navigational disruption to 7 surrounding systems if the development proceeded as specified. The data had been collected by Corvine scientists and analyzed in collaboration with human astrophysicists at a research station that had been quietly established, jointly funded, and deliberately kept out of the formal Concord scientific registry. The Safrani representative asked, in their careful, precise way, whether the agenda for this session had been properly noticed to all delegations given that 3 substantive modifications had been made to the Corridor Act's text between the first and second reading without formal notification. They provided documentation of the modifications. They requested, under the Concord's procedural rules, that the vote be delayed pending review. This was the first time in the Concord's recorded history that a procedural delay request had been made with complete and accurate documentation on the first attempt, citing the correct subsections of the procedural code, with supporting materials properly formatted according to all current administrative standards. The Mechari Collective spokesperson looked at the documentation for a very long time. The Kelvari ambassador rose last. He was old, older than almost anyone in the chamber, and he moved slowly to the speaking position. He said nothing for a moment after he arrived there. He looked around the room with the unhurried patience of someone who has waited a very long time and has decided, finally, that today is the day. Then he said that he wished to formally second the Safrani procedural delay request and add that he had identified 4 additional procedural irregularities in the Act's submission process, which he would be happy to submit to the administrative review panel at the appropriate time. He said this pleasantly. He sat down. The chamber president looked at Sorethvel. Sorethvel looked at his legal team's representative, who looked at the Mechari administrative coordinator, who was quietly but visibly recalculating something. The delay request could not be refused. The procedural code was clear. The documentation was correct. Everyone in the room could see it was correct. The vote was postponed pending administrative review, which under the Concord's rules could take between 2 weeks and 3 months, depending on the complexity of the issues raised. Given that 6 delegations had raised issues, the complexity was significant. As the session concluded and delegations began to disperse, Sorithvel walked across the chamber floor toward Vasquez. She had not spoken during the session. Her delegation had not spoken during the session. She was gathering her materials with the unhurried composure of someone who has accomplished what they came to accomplish. You prepared all of that, Sorithvel said. It was not quite a question. The Thalvine prepared their own remarks, Vasquez said. I thought they were excellent. The legal analysis, the environmental data, the procedural documentation. We contributed where we were invited to contribute, she said. Isn't that what you advised young species to do? Work collaboratively within established structures. He studied her. He was intelligent. She had always known that. And he was fast. She could see him reassessing things in real time. What do you want? He asked. The same thing we proposed at the 402nd session, she said pleasantly. A joint administrative framework for the node. Tiered access rights based on historical usage. Thalvine sovereignty protections. 20-year review. We thought it was a good proposal then. We still think so. And if we restructure the act along those lines, then 6 delegations will find no reason to pursue their procedural concerns, she said. And the act can proceed to a vote at the 408th session without delay. Sorithvel was quiet for a moment. Around them, the chamber emptied slowly. The old lights of the Concord Hall fell across centuries of carved stone, names and dates and decisions that had seemed, for 900 years, as permanent as gravity. You did all of this, he said slowly, without making a single threat. No war was declared, Vasquez agreed. She picked up her bag and walked toward the exit where her team was waiting. Ose caught her eye, and she made a small motion with her head. Not now, later. He nodded. They walked out together into the corridor, past the great seals of the Concord's founding species, past the portraits of 900 years of ambassadors who had built the structure that everyone had mistaken for the universe itself. Behind her, Sorithvel stood very still in the emptying chamber. He was beginning to understand that gravity had changed. The administrative review took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, 3 things happened simultaneously, in 3 different places, at 3 different speeds. The first thing was the formal review process itself, which unfolded exactly as the Concord's procedural rules required. Documents were submitted, examined, and certified. Irregularities in the Act's second reading modifications were confirmed, minor, arguably, but confirmed. The procedural challenge was ruled valid. The environmental and legal questions were flagged for subpanel review. It was paperwork. It was slow. It was, in its slow way, absolutely real. The second thing was a series of negotiations that Sorithvel initiated, quietly and without fanfare, with the human delegation. He sent a junior aide first, a young Velhari diplomat named Kareth Sol who had the careful, slightly over-eager manner of someone who had been told to gather information without giving any away. Vasquez received Kareth Sol courteously, gave him tea from Earth, answered his questions honestly, and sent him back with nothing he hadn't expected. 3 days later, Sorithvel came himself. That meeting was held in a small conference room at a neutral Concord facility, chosen by Sorithvel, which Vasquez took as a sign that he was serious. He arrived without his usual entourage, only his senior legal advisor and a translator, though his common tongue was as good as anyone's. Vasquez brought Dr. Karimi and Lieutenant Commander Ben David, who said almost nothing throughout, but had a way of sitting that made people aware that she had opinions. Sorithvel did not open with pleasantries. He opened with a question. How did you do it? Which part? Vasquez asked. The Kelvari. They have not participated meaningfully in an assembly floor debate in 180 years. We listened to them for 8 hours, Vasquez said. We didn't propose anything. We didn't ask for anything. We just listened. He considered this for a moment with an expression that was hard to read across the four-armed, blue-skinned species divide. Dr. Karimi later described it as a man finding a gear he didn't know was missing. We did not listen to them, Sorithvel said. Not as a confession. As an observation. No, Vasquez agreed, without elaboration. The conversation moved to the substance of the act. Sorithvel was direct. His government needed the hyperspace node. The 40% travel reduction was not a convenience. It was economically critical for maintaining Velhari trade networks across the Outer Rim. Without it, 2 of their major commercial routes became marginally unprofitable within a decade. This was not something he shared publicly. He was sharing it now, he said, because he had concluded that the alternative to a negotiated solution was a procedural war that served no one and made the Concord look structurally compromised. Vasquez appreciated the honesty. She matched it. She told him that humanity's actual goal had never been to block the node's development. It had been to ensure that the development didn't destroy the Thalvine's economy and establish a precedent that small species' historical rights were erasable whenever a dominant power found them inconvenient. Because that precedent would eventually be used against us, she said. We're a small species too. We've been here 12 years. Sorithvel looked at her for a long moment. You think like someone who has studied empires, he said. We've built a few, she said. We know how they end. The negotiations took 4 weeks of that 6-week review period. They were not easy. The Jorwin pushed back hard on the tiered access structure because any system that formalized historical usage rights created complications for their own disputed territories in the Mira expanse. The Mechari Collective's representatives raised 17 procedural concerns about the joint administrative body structure, most of which were genuine and 2 of which, Dr. Karimi concluded quietly, were designed to slow things down and see if the coalition would fracture under pressure. It didn't. Vithasorn of the Thalvine proved to be a sharper negotiator than anyone had expected. He had been a sharp negotiator for 30 years, it turned out, but had never before been in a room where sharpness was welcome. The third thing that happened during those 6 weeks was the quietest, and in many ways the most significant. It was a conversation between Femi Osei and a young Sothrani diplomat named Threshavalon, who had been assigned to Concord proceedings for only 8 months, and still found the Grand Chamber's scale genuinely overwhelming. They had met during the environmental data presentations, where Threshavalon had been scribbling notes with the concentrated urgency of someone trying to understand everything at once. Osei had recognized the expression. He had worn it himself, not long ago. He had offered to share the human delegation's annotated summary. Threshavalon had accepted with a gratitude that was almost excessive. They had talked for 2 hours that first day, and then again the next day, and by the 3rd week, they were having lunch together regularly at a small food station near the Concord's secondary research library. They talked about the Concord, about how it worked and how it claimed to work and the distance between those two things, about what young species owed themselves versus what they owed the structure they had joined, about whether you could change something from inside it, or whether inside and outside were fuzzier concepts than the chamber walls suggested. Threshavalon asked Osei once, over food neither of them had grown up eating, whether humans had always been like this, whether this was something specific to their species or something they had learned. Osei thought about it seriously, which Threshavalon had come to appreciate, the human habit of actually thinking before answering, rather than filling the silence with the first available response. We were terrible for a long time, Osei said finally. We did most of the things you're not supposed to do. We built hierarchies and told the people at the bottom that the hierarchy was the natural order of things. We did it inside our own species, which should have been obviously wrong. It took us centuries to mostly stop. But you did stop, Threshavalon said. Mostly, Osei said. And we remember what it cost. That's the part that stays. The 408th Grand Assembly session was held on a morning when the Concord's Central Station was cycling through its artificial day. Warm light, temperatures slightly elevated, the ambient hum of systems calibrated to promote alertness and moderate comfort. The chamber was full. Not every session drew a full chamber, but this one had been anticipated. The revised Dravith Corridor Resource Management Act was presented by a joint working group that included Velhari, Jorwin, Mechari, Thalvine, human, and pre-Thali representatives. The revision incorporated a joint administrative body for the hyperspace node with rotating representation and transparent governance rules. It established tiered access rights formally indexed to historical usage patterns going back 300 years, which meant the Thalvine's claims were not just protected, but written into the structural foundation of the Act. It included environmental guidelines co-authored with Corvine scientists. It built in a 20-year review process, Vasquez's original proposal, unchanged, and created an appeal mechanism through which any affected species could formally challenge administrative decisions without requiring a full assembly vote. It was not a perfect document. No document negotiated across 6 species' interests and 4 weeks of genuine argument ever is. But it was a good document. Dr. Karimi, who had read it 17 times by the morning of the session, thought it was possibly the best resource-sharing framework the Concord had produced in 150 years. The vote was 14 in favor, 0 against, 3 abstentions. The Mechari Collective abstained, not in opposition, their spokesperson clarified, but to formally register that they wished additional time had been available for administrative review. It was the most graceful form of face-saving available to them, and everyone in the chamber understood it as such. Vithithorn, when the vote was read, did not touch the wall this time. He sat very still. Then he made a gesture that translated, roughly, as gratitude directed at the open air, the Thalvine way of thanking something larger than any single person in a room. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Sorithvel fell into step beside Vasquez as they walked toward the exit. He did not look at her directly. He had the air of someone composing what he wanted to say as he walked. At the 402nd session, he said, "I said your proposal was thoughtful. For a young species." "I remember," she said. "I was wrong about the second part." She didn't answer immediately. They walked a few more steps. "You weren't wrong, exactly," she said. "We are young. We just have a long memory of being wrong, and it turns out that's useful." He considered this. They reached the main atrium, where the light from the station's viewport panels fell warm and gold across a floor that had been polished by 900 years of diplomatic foot traffic. Species moved around them in all directions, small, large, four-armed, six-legged, winged, ground-bound, old, new, uncertain, confident. "The other small species," Sorithvel said. "They will be more active now. The Concord will be noisier." "Yes," Vasquez agreed. "And you think that is better?" She stopped walking and looked at him. It was a genuine question. She could tell he was genuinely uncertain of the answer, which told her more about the Concord's last 900 years than almost anything else she had learned. That the dominant powers had mistaken quiet for health, had mistaken the small species' silence for contentment, had sat in their well-placed seats and listened to a room that wasn't telling them anything real for so long that they had started to think the silence was the sound a healthy galaxy made. "I think noise is what you get when people believe they'll be heard," she said. "And I think you want to be in a Concord where people believe that, even when it's inconvenient. Especially then." He thought about this. Then he said, "You are going to be very difficult to work with for the next several centuries." "Probably," she agreed, and walked on. Femi Osei was waiting near the main exit with Threshavelin and Vithithorn and a pre-Thale junior diplomat, whose name Osei was still learning to pronounce correctly. They were talking, all four of them, in the easy, overlapping way of people who have stopped being cautious with each other. Dr. Karimi stood slightly to the side with a data pad and the deeply satisfied expression of a man whose cartography had turned out to be accurate. Ben David fell into step beside Vasquez as she approached the group. "How'd it go with Sorithvel?" "He said we'll be difficult to work with for centuries," Vasquez said. Ben David considered this. "That's basically a compliment." "That's exactly what it is," Vasquez said. No war had been declared. No ultimatum delivered. No fleet positioned. No threat issued. No line drawn in the dark between stars. Humanity had simply stepped back from a game that wasn't working, looked at who else was losing it, and started building something different in the space that stepping back had opened. The Galactic Concord continued. It was noisier now, more complicated, more contested, harder to manage and harder to ignore. 900 years of quiet had produced a structure. What came after the quiet would produce something else, something that didn't have a name yet, because it was still in the process of becoming. In the atrium, under the golden light, a group of young diplomats from 6 different species laughed at something. The sound rose up into the high ceilings and scattered there, bright and complicated, like the beginning of a language that everyone was still learning to speak.